great news is that low-cost carriers are arriving in North Asia. As Derek said, we were first here doing our first conference actually in Kitakyushu in Japan, low-cost airlines in North Asia in 2005, and then back here in Macau in 2004 in another issue. It's taken a long time for the low-cost airline revolution to reach Northeast Asia, but I think what's happened this year is that the developments in Japan particularly have precipitated things, starting in 2010 and then having, I think, probably a record in the world, 3 low-cost carriers starting in one country in the same, within a period of about 4 months. I think that's got to be something of a record. So if I could just have my first slide, please. I have to do this, I'm afraid, just talk a little bit about CAPA, but it'll be very little bit. If you're not a member of CAPA, please talk to Jonathan or Derek, and we'll show you the great merits of being involved in our activities. The top story up there, if I could just go back, top story up there, Airlines in Transition, a Rust Belt Industry, is the feature story in our airline leader, and there are copies of that available. I think we have about 50 of them, maybe 100, so please avail yourself of that if you haven't got one yet. I'm going to cover just really the outline of what we're going to be talking about during the next 2 days. The arrival of low-cost carriers in North Asia, the regulatory change that is accompanying that and also helping it, the implications for travel and tourism, just what is the tourism industry, the travel industry doing, and how is it going to be affected by these new low-cost carriers. And then the inevitable one of hybridising the low-cost carriers, the new age airlines, the compromising of the basic model from pure low cost to improving yield and looking for some of the features of full service carriers. And then finally, an issue which we're going to develop further on Friday in our finance conference, how are we going to fund all the aircraft that are being ordered now? Because it's a different sort of world. Nothing particularly new here, but the reason that things are going to start happening very, very quickly now is that so many people in this region, there's a very dense region, densely populated region, in terms of the number of residents of the countries within the triangle up here, in China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, the number of urban centres, the number of potential city pairs, which have never been served because the incumbent airlines really didn't want to. They wanted to work to hubs, and because regulation didn't allow them to fly to anywhere else but the main destinations. Those cities have got large populations which are now reaching economic thresholds that allow them to fly. Particularly, their economic wealth is going up as the fares are coming down. So you get that double whammy, that benefit that so many more people can now afford to fly. The key to having low-cost carriers, and this in many ways is actually probably more important than the fares, is the fact that we are having new entry. New airlines are coming in, and if you think back, over 20 years up until about 2000, the early 2000s, there were no new carriers. All the international operations were performed by full-service carriers, flag carriers, and there was no great process of change. There was no need to change. There was actually inertia to prevent change happening. That is now changing rapidly. Low price travel, I mentioned that. The innovation with new entry. How do I differentiate my product? What do I do to try to attract passengers? It's not just about price. I've got to do something innovative. And then on a broader scale, what is happening, independently of aviation, but very much helped by it, is trade expanding between nations within Asia, particularly within ASEAN, but that's something that really didn't happen very much until, again, the last couple of decades, but particularly in the last decade. So we have a very simple equation. Liberalisation, plus new entry, plus low fares, and the very important corporate low-cost culture, which we'll hear a lot about over the next couple of days, means we have a revolution, a transformation of the market, and potentially explosive growth. On a global scheme, something like 25% of all seats provided in the airline industry, domestic and international, are on low-cost carriers. That proportion is much smaller in Asia. It's about 1 in 5. It's growing, it's getting close. But in this region, it's 1 in 15. That gives you an idea of the dimension, the scope for expansion, and the impact that that's likely to have if and when it does come about. We've got a long way to go. A lot of that snap of the elastic just to get up to the sort of level that we can expect and that we've witnessed elsewhere in the world. So we now have a different marketplace. These quotes are taken from just this last month, the type of things that have happened in Japan with the new entrants there. AirAsia, this was just yesterday, in its first month of operation, August 2012, operating an 85% load factor, carried 54,000 passengers. The month before, some 3 million people flew on domestic flights through the Japanese holidays, up 1%. But if you look, the full service carriers were down, operating at load factors of 73, 74%. The very, very small new low-cost entrants were operating right up around 90% load factors and carried something like 3% of the total. Now that doesn't sound a lot, but 4 months earlier it couldn't have happened because they didn't exist. That's the sort of trajectory we have of growth potential. One of the interesting things that the Japanese learned out of this is that with most of the carriers, I think, and we'll hear some of this from Keach and others, is that typically on those services, and this is no surprise to those of you who've been familiar with the broadcast industry, something like 30% of those passengers in holidays had never travelled before by air. The other thing, though, that happens is that, and this has been experienced particularly in Europe, that regular travellers fly a whole lot more. And it changes lifestyles. We're also hearing already in Japan, oh, now I can go shopping for the day. Now I can pop up to Sapporo, because previously it would take me a month's pay to fly on that route. Fares have come down as much as 75%, and more in some cases. Makes a big difference. On a broader scale, across Asia, we've got 3 large brands now expanding. And this is one of the interesting phenomena too. These are brands that go beyond the national geographic designation. They're not Singapore, they're not Malaysia, they're not Australia. They're AirAsia, Tiger, and Jetstar. You all know them well. And they're gradually expanding. We'll hear a lot about the particular features of the expansion in Asia, which are different in many ways from the rest of the world. Another issue we're going to look at this morning is there a connect between the travel industry, travel and tourism side of the business, and the aviation industry? And we'll hear some interesting thoughts on this from our second panel. Airports, as most of the airlines know, have been pretty slow to adapt to the needs of low-cost carriers, which are different in many ways from the full-service carriers. And tourism authorities, particularly, can often not really fully comprehend what's going on. And there's often an attitude towards low-cost carriers that, well, they're not really about serious business. They're just fall down a hole in a minute, I'm sorry. If I do, I'll try to keep talking. Next slide. One of the other topics we're going to be looking about is hybridizing. And that means the implications of that, as airlines add different products, means that the whole system has to change too. We'll hear some interesting discussions what happens to airports and with distribution systems. There's sort of difficulties that are being created for the old system, which is creaking and trying to accommodate these new players who have different needs. How do we adapt to them? How do we provide distribution systems that work? How do we allow, at airports, how do we allow passengers to connect who never used to want to, or whose airlines never wanted to? So, what we're seeing here is a constant road. Most of it's uphill, of course, because we're talking about airlines. The new age airlines are hybridizing, they're adding business features, they're going long haul, and this is one of the particular features of this region, of course, the subsidiaries, the full service carrier subsidiaries, which are very different in many ways from the experiences elsewhere. We'll look at that also. And as I mentioned before, we're getting these Pan-Asian brands which transcend national boundaries. So, as the industry evolves, it's having real pressures, it's creating real pressures on the existing system. For example, full service carriers, and we're seeing this very much in Europe, cannot bring their costs down to a level from where they are to where they need to be. And that's really creating a lot of issues, particularly for network carriers who need short-haul feed. They cannot compete on those short-haul sectors because basically their costs are about 30% higher, at least, than the low-cost carriers they're competing with. The consequence is they're forced to focus much more on long-haul operations, where competition is less steep and where entry is more expensive and harder. Then at home, the whole short-haul operation is transforming customer behaviour. And we're not just talking about leisure travellers, we're talking about business travellers too. For corporates, price is becoming so much more important. For business travellers, obviously the same. And as a consequence, there's a real decline in usage of business class travel, decline in the ability to extract much higher yields in business class. And so we're seeing things like premium economy becoming the middle road for the full service carriers. And then, as I mentioned, the fact that the full service carriers are losing their short haul feed is meaning it creates much greater pressures on them to adapt. And it's a slow process, but in many cases I think we really will see that some of the large carriers do not survive the next 5 years because as long haul becomes more competitive and they get squeezed more on short haul, the ability to make money just dries out. And then finally, one last session tomorrow afternoon as an intro to our Finance Day on Friday. We've got this big issue of funding the industry. There's an awful amount going on in Europe, as you're probably very well aware. European bankers are becoming very risk averse. American bankers the same. They don't want to be lending money to anything that isn't cast iron safe. And they don't, traditionally, these have been the lenders for the Asian carriers too. They don't, in many cases, fully understand or feel safe with something that's happening on the other side of the world. All the traditional lenders are in Europe and North America. The newer ones in Asia are very active, but they still need to be, for example, we've lost a bit off the screen here, but what that says is the Asian LCCs alone, just the Asian LCCs, have something like 1,000 aircraft on order now for this decade. That's a massive change. It's a large number of aircraft, but it's also to new carriers who don't have a long track record. And this creates issues for this region, and it creates enormous pressures to develop a financing capability in Asia. And that's one of the things we'll be looking at tomorrow afternoon and then into Friday. Okay, I think that's about where I end that one. I do hope you enjoy the conference, and I think you'll enjoy it more if you do take the opportunity to ask questions, to challenge what's going on, and to contribute your views to what's happening. So thank you very much, and we'll move on to the first panel. Thank you. Our first panel is on the regulatory framework, so we begin at the foundation of things. If I could just invite in order on the program here, Professor Tayoum, who's President of the Air Transport Research Society and also a professor from Vancouver. Tayoum, Professor. Professor Zhou Wenfu, who's Associate Professor at Hong Kong Polytechnic. Thanks, Tayoum. Yes, indeed. Give him a big hand. Professor Mano Lourdes, who's Regional VP of IATA and has a lot of experience, based in Singapore, has a lot of experience in the aviation industry and particularly in the low-cost airline industry. And last but certainly not least, Patrick Murphy, who's Non-Executive Director of Peach Aviation, one of Japan's newest low-cost carriers. And for those of you who hear me call him Paddy sometimes, it's an English abbreviation of an Irish name. We do that with Patrick's name. Oh, okay. So just a very short introductory, you've heard enough from me pretty much, but I just want to give a few short introductory points on this panel, where we're coming from, the regulatory matters. So if I could just, what have I done? You okay? Oh, that was cleverer than I thought it was. So what we're talking about is essentially this triangle in North Asia and what's happening with the regulatory framework. Japan, it's hard not to start with Japan because it is such an interesting environment. Things have changed very dramatically, but until 2010, really things didn't change very much at all. The whole system was focused around Tokyo Airport, or the Tokyo airports, and anything really about Japan was flying to and from there, domestic and international. New entry was virtually impossible in a commercial way because of a high cost base, because of the great power of the two incumbents, all Nippon and JAL. And we had this political system, which isn't unique to Japan, but probably more accentuated there, of pork barrel airports. About 95 airports in Japan, and that map there shows you how densely they are situated. Most of them unprofitable, most of them largely underutilised, and really crying out, this is the positive of the low-cost airline point of view, really crying out to be used. The problem with that, though, has been that because all the costs of those airports go into a single pot, the airport charges in Japan tend to be about the highest in the world in most cases. And that's something that is starting to change and will be very important for the industry. What happened after 2010 was, first of all, we saw JAL go bankrupt, which was a great surprise to many, but not to everybody. I think the surprise was that it was actually allowed to happen, that it went through, and the impact of that has been dramatic. As you probably are aware, JAL is just in the process of an IPO in the next 2 weeks. see the outcome of that. It looks as if that IPO is going to go through, which is a positive, but with what's going on in Japan now, it's going to be a very interesting road for the Japanese carriers. As part of this process, though, the Japanese government has adopted a whole much more liberal international policy of open skies agreements, and a lot of that will start to flow through the system in 2013. It's very positive outlook from that point of view. 3 new carriers coming at the low-cost end, all of them subsidiaries of full-service carriers. There is some talk of privatising. There's a lot of talk of privatising, but whether it will happen is another issue. And one of the reasons for the high costs has been safety regulations that really are, by world standards, excessive. Those are starting to be at least considered, and in some cases realised. Korea has had a much more balanced approach. The domestic carriers were very badly hurt when high-speed rail was introduced in the last decade, in the late 90s. And with the emergence of some homegrown low-cost carriers, in most cases not independent, but subsidiaries or part subsidiaries of the full-service carriers, there has been a reasonably healthy growth of low-cost carriers in Korea. And with an international policy that is fairly relaxed in most cases, Korea is looking quite good. But the important thing has been, I think, largely because of these low-cost carriers, that we've seen strong inbound growth particularly from China and from Japan. Taiwan is interesting. I was there with our 2 professors a couple of months ago, and there's a sort of eerie quiet, particularly from the airlines there, who don't really seem to recognise that their costs are high by international standards, certainly on short-haul routes, and are not really seriously considering, as I understand it anyway, we'll talk more about this, getting into a low-cost mode or adopting low-cost subsidiaries. One exception, the independent TransAsia, which is, I think, I know there's some TransAsia here, looking probably better equipped to deal with these changes. China is an interesting case, producing obviously some very, very powerful airlines, some very big market potential, but the focus of the Chinese policy is still on protecting the big 3 carriers. That is starting to disperse somewhat just through market pressures, but it is still a restraint on the activity of low-cost carriers with price controls. At the same time, though, paradoxically, the existence of foreign low-cost carriers operating into China internationally is again creating new market growth, but also creating some opportunities for, probably from a regulatory point of view, to see changes in the way things work. But it's still, for fairly obvious reasons, particularly when you think that a cornerstone of its policy is around protecting the big 3 so that they can grow into internationally competitive entities, it still has a conservative bilateral policy, certainly at the major cities. Okay, with that, we'll continue straight into the panel.